January 28th, 1986. 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time. 73 seconds. That's all it took for the impossible to happen, for the unthinkable to become reality, for 7 lives to be lost in front of the entire world. I was there. Not as a spectator, not as a journalist watching from the press site. I was part of the launch team. I had my hands on the systems that were supposed to keep those astronauts safe. I wore the badge. I signed off on the checks. I was inside the machine that built that shuttle. And for 38 years, I've carried the weight of what I saw, what I knew, and what I wish I had done differently. This is my story. This is what really happened behind the scenes of America's worst space disaster. And I need to tell you this because the lessons we learned that day, we're still not listening to them. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I witnessed. So let me take you back. Back to the cold. Back to the pressure. Back to the morning when everything changed. If you're under 40, you probably don't remember what NASA meant to America in the 1980s. The Space Shuttle wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol. It was proof that we had conquered space, that we could go up there whenever we wanted, come back safe, and do it all over again next month. Routine. That was the word everyone used. Space travel had become routine. I started working at Kennedy Space Center in 1982, fresh out of engineering school, stars in my eyes and a head full of calculations. Getting that job felt like winning the lottery. My friends were designing air conditioning units and traffic lights. I was going to help put people in space. The shuttle program was NASA's crown jewel. After Apollo, after we'd planted flags on the moon and proved we could beat the Soviets, the shuttle was supposed to be the next logical step. A reusable spacecraft, a truck to low Earth orbit, something that could launch satellites, conduct experiments, and make space accessible. Not just for test pilots and military heroes anymore, for scientists, for engineers, for teachers. That's what made Challenger so special in January of 1986. Krista McAuliffe, the teacher in space, a social studies teacher from New Hampshire who had beaten out 11,000 other educators for the chance to teach lessons from orbit. Do you understand what that meant? It meant space wasn't just for the elite anymore. It meant your teacher, your neighbor, your sister could go to space. It meant the final frontier was opening up to all of us. The shuttle program had flown 24 successful missions before Challenger's final flight. 24 times we'd sent people up and brought them home safe. We were getting good at this. Maybe too good. Maybe too confident. I worked in the Environmental Control Systems Division. That meant life support, essentially. The systems that kept the crew cabin pressurized, that controlled temperature and humidity, that scrubbed CO2 from the air, and kept 7 human beings alive in the vacuum of space. My systems weren't the ones that failed that day, but I was part of the team. I was in the loop, and I heard the conversations that happened in the days leading up to the launch, the conversations that haunt me still. Here's what you need to understand about Kennedy Space Center in 1986. It was the most advanced technological facility on planet Earth. We had engineers and technicians who were the best in the world. People who had worked on Apollo. People who had forgotten more about rocketry than most universities could teach. The vehicle assembly building alone was overwhelming. 52 stories tall, so big it had its own weather system inside. Clouds could form near the ceiling on humid days. That's where we stacked the shuttle. The external tank, the solid rocket boosters, the orbiter itself. Challenger was orbiter vehicle OV-099. The second shuttle to join the fleet, first launched in 1983. She'd flown 9 successful missions before STS-51-L, 9 times to space and back. The crew of STS-51-L was incredible. Francis Dick Scobie, the commander. Air Force veteran, test pilot, a man who had logged over 6,500 hours in 45 different aircraft. Michael Smith, the pilot, Navy aviator, another test pilot with thousands of hours of flight time. Judith Resnick, mission specialist. The second American woman in space, an electrical engineer with a PhD. Ellison Onizuka, mission specialist, Air Force officer, aerospace engineer, the first Asian American in space. Ronald McNair, mission specialist, physicist, saxophonist, laser scientist, the second African American in space. Gregory Jarvis, payload specialist, Hughes aircraft engineer, satellite expert, and Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, mother of 2, wife, teacher, dreamer, 7 people who trusted us completely. I met Krista once, briefly, in the crew quarters about a week before the launch. She was so excited, nervous, yes, but radiating this pure joy. She kept asking questions about everything. How does this work? What does that do? Like a kid in a candy store. I'm going to teach from space, she told me, grinning. Can you imagine? Kids all over America watching their first science lesson from orbit. I remember thinking, this is why we do this job. This moment right here. This is what it's all about. I wish I could go back and tell her to wait. Just wait one more day. Let us check one more time. Let the temperature rise just a few more degrees. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Florida in January. Usually it's beautiful. Mid-70s, maybe low 80s. Sunny. Perfect weather for a shuttle launch, honestly. You want clear skies, mild winds, comfortable temperatures for the thousands of components that have to work in perfect harmony. January 1986 was different. A cold front swept down from Canada in the days before the scheduled launch. And I mean cold for Florida. We're talking temperatures dropping into the 20s overnight. Freezing. Ice forming on the launch pad. Ice. At Kennedy Space Center. That wasn't normal. That wasn't in the nominal operating parameters for a lot of our systems. The original launch date was January 22nd. We scrubbed that one due to weather delays at the transatlantic abort landing sites in Senegal. Then we had issues with the exterior hatch. Then more weather. Then problems with the ground support equipment. Each delay added pressure. NASA had promised frequent shuttle flights. We were supposed to be launching once a month, or even more often. The shuttle program was expensive, billions of dollars, and Congress wanted to see results. The public wanted to see results. We had satellites to deploy, experiments to run, a space station to start thinking about, and we had the teacher in space. The media attention around Krista McAuliffe was unprecedented. Every news network in America was planning to broadcast the launch live. Schools across the country were wheeling TVs into classrooms so students could watch. The president was going to mention it in his State of the Union address that night. The pressure to launch wasn't just technical, it was political, it was public relations, it was NASA's image as the can-do agency that made the impossible look easy. By January 27th, we were ready to try again. Launch scheduled for 9:38 a.m. on the 28th. But that cold front just wouldn't leave. I remember walking out to the parking lot after the evening shift on the 27th. It was already cold, way colder than it should have been. My breath was fogging in the air, in Florida, in January. Something felt wrong. The launch team was working around the clock. We had 3 shifts of people monitoring systems, running checks, preparing for the morning launch. I was on the early morning shift, scheduled to be at my console by 5 a.m. I drove home, tried to sleep. Couldn't really. You never sleep well the night before a launch anyway. Too much adrenaline, too much anticipation, too much going through your head about every system, every check, every possible failure mode. Around 1:30 a.m., I got a call from a colleague. "You seeing this temperature forecast?" I pulled it up. Low of 18 degrees predicted for just before dawn, 18 degrees Fahrenheit at the launch pad. "That's going to ice everything up," I said. "Yeah, they're already talking about it. Ice teams being mobilized." The ice team. A specialized group of engineers and technicians whose job was to inspect the launch pad for ice accumulation before a launch. Ice was dangerous. Ice could break off during the vibration and acceleration of launch, could damage the thermal protection tiles on the shuttle's underside, could be ingested into the engines. "Are we still go for launch?" I asked. Silence on the other end. "As of now, yeah. But there's going to be meetings all night." There were indeed meetings all night. I wasn't in most of them. I was too junior, too specialized in my particular systems. But word filtered down through the team. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, were worried. Specifically, they were worried about the O-rings. Let me explain what an O-ring is, because this is where everything went wrong. The solid rocket boosters were the two white rockets strapped to either side of the shuttle's external fuel tank. They provided most of the thrust to get the shuttle off the pad. 71% of the thrust at liftoff came from those two boosters. Each booster was made up of several cylindrical segments stacked on top of each other. Where those segments joined together, there were field joints, and those field joints were sealed with rubber O-rings. 2 O-rings per joint, actually. A primary O-ring and a secondary O-ring as backup. The job of those O-rings was simple but critical. Keep the hot gases from the burning solid fuel inside the booster. Don't let them leak out. Because if superheated gas, we're talking 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, escaped from a field joint, it could burn through the external tank, ignite the liquid hydrogen and oxygen inside, and cause a catastrophic explosion. The O-rings were made of rubber, synthetic rubber specifically, a material called V-tone, and rubber gets stiff when it's cold. The engineers at Thiokol knew this. They'd been studying the O-rings for months because they'd seen evidence of heat damage on the O-rings from previous flights. Erosion, blow-by. Signs that the O-rings weren't always sealing perfectly during the first seconds of launch. On the evening of January 27th, the Thiokol engineers were panicking. They'd never launched in temperatures this cold. The coldest previous launch had been at 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And that flight, STS-51C a year earlier, had shown the worst O-ring erosion they'd ever seen. Now they were looking at a launch with temperatures in the low 20s, possibly teens. The teleconference that night between Thiokol and NASA has become legendary. It's been written about in books, investigated by presidential commissions, taught in engineering ethics classes. But here's what you need to know. The engineers said no. The Thiokol engineers recommended, formally and clearly, that NASA not launch until the temperature reached at least 53 degrees. They presented their data. They showed the correlation between cold temperatures and O-ring problems. They explained the physics, how the rubber would be too stiff to seal properly, how there wouldn't be enough resilience in the material to respond to the pressure and motion during ignition. They said, "We don't know what will happen if you launch in these temperatures. We've never tested the O-rings this cold. We have no data. We can't guarantee they'll work." And then something happened that still makes me sick to think about. The managers overruled the engineers. I need you to understand, this wasn't NASA overruling Thiokol. Initially, yes, NASA management pushed back hard. They questioned the recommendation. They asked for proof, for data, for certainty. But the final decision, the decision to say, yes, we can launch, came from Thiokol's own management. The engineers were told to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats, to think about the program, the schedule, the bigger picture. One manager told the engineers to prove that it was unsafe to launch, rather than requiring NASA to prove it was safe. Think about that for a second. In engineering, the burden of proof is supposed to be on safety. You prove something is safe before you do it. You don't just go ahead unless someone can prove it's dangerous. They reversed that logic, and 7 people died because of it. I didn't know all these details on the night of the 27th. I just knew there were concerns about the O-rings. I knew it was really cold, and I knew we were still scheduled to launch in the morning. I got to the Launch Control Center at 4:45 a.m. on January 28th. It was freezing, literally freezing, ice everywhere, and we were go for launch. Kennedy Space Center at dawn on launch day is like nowhere else on Earth. The lights, the sounds, the energy. Thousands of people moving with purpose, each one a critical piece of an impossibly complex puzzle. Engineers at consoles, technicians at the pad, the close-out crew helping the astronauts into their seats, range safety officers monitoring weather and tracking stations, the firing room coordinating it all. And on January 28th, all of it happening in temperatures that made your bones ache. I grabbed coffee, terrible coffee, but hot, and headed to my station. My console monitored the environmental control systems. Cabin pressure, temperature control, atmosphere composition. On the big boards at the front of the firing room, I could see all the other systems reporting in. Propulsion, guidance, communications, electrical, hundreds of parameters, all of which had to be green before we could launch. The first thing I heard about was the ice. The ice inspection team had been out at the pad since before dawn, and what they found was unprecedented. Icicles hanging from the fixed service structure, some of them over a foot long. Ice on the walkways, ice on the handrails, ice on the mobile launch platform, and ice on the shuttle itself. Particularly concerning, ice on the right solid rocket booster, just sitting there, frozen to the surface. Hundreds of pounds of ice that could break off during launch, could damage the orbiter, could cause any number of problems. How much ice are we talking about? Someone asked over the comm loop. Enough that we're running calculations on debris impact risk, came the reply. The ice team did multiple inspections. They photographed everything. They measured temperatures at various points on the pad, on the external tank, on the boosters. One temperature reading haunts me. 8 degrees Fahrenheit on the lower field joint of the right solid rocket booster. 8 degrees. The engineers had been worried about launching at 53 degrees. Now we were looking at temperatures a fraction of that, right at the joints where the O-rings had to seal. But here's the thing about NASA in 1986. We had faith in our systems. We had redundancy. We had backup plans for our backup plans. The O-rings had a secondary seal. We'd launched successfully 24 times. The engineering was sound, wasn't it? The launch director, Gene Thomas, held multiple management meetings about the ice, about the temperatures, about whether we should delay. But the forecast wasn't good. The cold snap was supposed to continue for days. If we waited for temperatures to rise significantly, we might be waiting a week or more. More delays, more media attention, more pressure from Washington, and the Thiokol engineers' concerns from the night before. That recommendation not to launch below 53 degrees, it never made it to the launch director. I didn't know that then. None of us in the firing room knew that. We assumed that all the relevant engineering data had been considered, that all the concerns had been addressed, that the decision to proceed had been made with full knowledge of the risks. We were wrong. Around 9 a.m., the ice team completed their final inspection. They reported that while there was still ice present, it was within acceptable limits. They'd used heaters and water to clear the most critical areas. The debris risk was judged to be acceptable. The launch was still go. I ran through my own pre-launch checklist. Cabin pressure control systems? Nominal. Temperature regulation? Nominal. CO2 scrubbers? Nominal. Emergency oxygen systems? Nominal. Everything on my end was perfect. The astronauts were already in the shuttle. They'd boarded hours earlier, been strapped into their seats, gone through their own pre-launch checks. Krista McAuliffe was in the mid-deck, in a seat that hadn't even existed on earlier shuttle missions. The shuttle was so routine now that we'd added extra seats for non-pilot passengers. I wonder what they talked about during those final hours. Whether they were nervous, whether they noticed how long the ice inspection was taking, whether they felt the cold seeping through the orbiter's skin. Mission control in Houston was ready. The range was clear. Weather was acceptable. Cold, yes, but clear skies and light winds. The external tank was loaded with over 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, super chilled to cryogenic temperatures. We were going. The launch window opened at 9:38 a.m., but we held for the ice inspection. Then we held for a problem with the fire detection system at the pad. Then we held for some handle that needed to be stowed. Minor issues. Normal stuff. We were used to holds. The countdown resumed. We worked through the final built-in holds. T-20 minutes and holding. T-9 minutes and holding. Each time we came out of a hold, the energy in the firing room ratcheted up another notch. This was it. After all the delays, all the scrubs, all the waiting, this was it. At T-9 minutes, we came out of the final planned hold. The countdown went automatic at T-31 seconds. That meant the computers had full control now. No more human intervention unless something went very wrong. The ground launch sequencer was running the show. I watched my displays. Everything green. Cabin pressure holding steady at 14.7 pounds per square inch. Temperatures nominal. All systems reporting ready. Around me, dozens of other engineers were watching their own systems. Propulsion, hydraulics, electrical power, navigation, communications, all green, all go. The people in the viewing areas, the VIP stands, the press site, the employee viewing area, were packed shoulder to shoulder. Families of the crew. Krista McAuliffe's parents and students from her school in New Hampshire who'd traveled down to watch their teacher make history. The networks were broadcasting live. Millions of children in schools across America were watching. Everyone was ready to witness something wonderful. T-10 seconds. The shuttle's main engines began their start sequence. I could hear it through the building, a growing roar even from 3 miles away. T-6 seconds, main engines at full thrust, over 1 million pounds of force. The shuttle swayed on the pad. It always did that, what they called the twang. The whole stack flexing as the engines came up to power. T-0. The solid rocket boosters ignited, and with a thunder that shook the earth, Challenger lifted off. 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time. 3, 2, 1. And liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower. That's what we heard from the public affairs officer. Calm, professional, routine. In the firing room, we were watching our screens. Every console had different data, different telemetry streaming up from the shuttle in real time. I was watching life support systems, cabin pressure, atmospheric composition, CO2 levels, temperature. Everything was nominal. But in the back of the firing room, on the big screens that showed the video feeds from the tracking cameras, something was already wrong. I didn't see it. I was watching my numbers, my systems, my responsibility, but the video engineers saw it. The tracking camera operators saw it. At 0.678 seconds after ignition, less than a second into the flight, a puff of dark smoke appeared from the aft field joint of the right solid rocket booster. Just a puff. Then another. Then another. 8 puffs in total in the first 2.5 seconds of flight. The O-ring was failing. The primary O-ring in that field joint had been too cold, too stiff. When the booster ignited, the pressure wave from the burning propellant deformed the metal casing slightly. Exactly what it was supposed to do. The O-ring was supposed to flex and fill that gap, creating a seal, but it was too cold. It couldn't respond fast enough. Hot gas, 5,000-degree combustion products, began to escape through the gap. The secondary O-ring should have caught it. That was the whole point of having a backup. But the same pressure that had deformed the primary seal had also moved the secondary O-ring out of position. For those first 2.5 seconds, the right solid rocket booster was venting superheated gas directly through its side. But then something lucky happened. Aluminum oxide, a byproduct of the solid fuel burning, began to accumulate in the gap. It formed a temporary plug, a seal made of molten debris. The smoke puffs stopped. The leak was temporarily plugged. Nobody in the firing room knew any of this was happening. The telemetry from the boosters was limited. They were solid fuel rockets, not exactly sophisticated. Once you lit them, they burned until they were empty. No throttle control, no shutdown capability. All my data looked perfect. Cabin pressure holding steady, temperature stable. The crew was fine. Challenger cleared the tower and began its roll program, rotating so that the orbiter was underneath the external tank, the orientation needed for the trajectory to orbit. "Roll program confirmed," came the call from Houston. "Roger, roll, Challenger," responded Dick Scobie from the flight deck. His voice was calm. Everything was going according to plan. The shuttle accelerated. It always started slow, heavy, fighting against gravity, but as the fuel burned off, as the mass decreased, it got faster and faster. 20 seconds into flight, we passed through max Q, maximum dynamic pressure, the point where the stress on the vehicle from atmospheric drag was at its highest. This was always a critical moment. If structural problems were going to appear, max Q was where you'd see them. "Challenger, go at throttle up," called Houston. "Roger, go at throttle up," Scobie responded. Those would be the last words anyone ever heard from Challenger's crew. The main engines throttled up from 65% to 104%. The shuttle accelerated harder. 59 seconds into flight, the temporary seal of aluminum oxide in the aft field joint, weakened by aerodynamic forces and vibration, broke loose. The leak was back. This time, instead of puffs of smoke, it was a continuous, well-defined flame. Superheated gas jetting out of the side of the right solid rocket booster like a blowtorch, and it was pointed directly at the external tank. The external tank was basically a giant thermos bottle, holding over 500,000 gallons of the most explosive propellants imaginable. The aft section held liquid oxygen at -297 degrees Fahrenheit. The forward section held liquid hydrogen at -423 degrees Fahrenheit. Between them was the intertank structure, and that's where the flame was hitting. The flame was over 5,000 degrees. It took just seconds, 64 seconds into flight. The flame burned through the intertank structure and began eating into the liquid hydrogen tank below. Liquid hydrogen began to leak, began to vaporize in the heat of the flame. At the same time, the flame was burning through the lower strut that connected the solid rocket booster to the external tank, the structural attachment that kept the whole stack aligned. In the firing room, we still saw nothing wrong. My data was nominal. Cabin pressure was fine. Everyone's data looked good. On the video feeds, though, you could see it. The flame was visible now, growing, changing in intensity as the shuttle punched through different layers of atmosphere. 72 seconds into flight, the lower strut failed. The structural connection between the right solid rocket booster and the external tank broke. The booster, still firing at full thrust, still producing over 1,000,000 pounds of force, swiveled on its remaining upper attachment point. The nose of the booster rotated forward, smashing into the intertank section of the external tank. The impact ruptured both the liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen tanks. 73 seconds into flight, 400,000 gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, propellants that would normally burn in a controlled manner in rocket engines, mixed and ignited in an uncontrolled explosion. The external tank disintegrated. The force of the explosion, combined with the aerodynamic pressures at an altitude of 46,000 feet and a speed of Mach 1.92, tore the shuttle stack apart. In the firing room, the telemetry displays went blank. All at once. Every system. Just gone. I stared at my screen, not understanding. Loss of signal, a communications problem, but it wasn't just my data. It was everyone's. Someone said, "What happened?" Someone else said, "We lost telemetry." And then we looked up at the video screens. Where Challenger should have been, climbing on a pillar of fire towards space, there was just chaos. White clouds blooming against the blue sky. Not one trail, but multiple trails, pieces spinning away from each other, tumbling, falling. The solid rocket boosters, now freed from the destroyed external tank, corkscrewed through the air like insane fireworks, their propellant still burning, their thrust now pointed in random directions as they tumbled. Debris, everywhere. A cloud of debris where the shuttle had been. The firing room went silent. Not a confused silence. Not a questioning silence. A silence of absolute horror, of knowing, of understanding in an instant that something catastrophic had just happened. "Flight, we have no data," someone said quietly. On the video feed, the camera operators were trying to track... What? There was nothing to track. The shuttle was gone. There was just falling debris. The two solid rocket boosters spiraling out of control and that awful cloud spreading across the sky. The range safety officer activated the destruct charges on the solid rocket boosters. Two bright flashes as the remaining threats were eliminated. They fell into the Atlantic Ocean, 35 miles offshore. And somewhere in all that chaos, somewhere in that cloud of debris, was the crew cabin. The orbiter had broken apart around them, but the crew cabin, reinforced, designed to protect the astronauts during re-entry, had remained largely intact. It separated from the explosion. It arced upward, carried by momentum, reaching a peak altitude of 65,000 feet. And then it fell. 2 minutes and 45 seconds of freefall. The cabin hit the ocean at over 200 miles per hour. In the firing room, we sat frozen. Someone needed to say something. Someone needed to do something. But what? What do you do when the impossible has just happened? When your worst nightmare, the thing that never, ever was supposed to happen, just occurred in front of millions of people? The launch director's voice came over the comm loop, shaking, "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves this room. Impound all data." It was protocol for a major anomaly. Preserve the evidence. Start the investigation. But it felt surreal. We were supposed to be monitoring a shuttle on its way to orbit. We were supposed to be watching 7 astronauts float free of their seats in 6 minutes, grinning as they experienced weightlessness. Instead, we were locking doors and securing data for an investigation. The public affairs officer's voice, that calm, professional voice that had announced liftoff, came over the speakers. "Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction." Major malfunction. What a sterile, inadequate phrase for what we had just witnessed. On the screens, ships were already moving toward the debris field. Coast Guard cutters, recovery vessels. They'd been stationed offshore as a precaution, never expecting to actually be needed. I don't remember the next few minutes very clearly. I think I was in shock. We all were. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying. Most of us just sat there, staring at screens that showed nothing but no data messages. Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judy Resnick, Elon Izuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, Krista McAuliffe. 7 names. 7 people who had climbed into that shuttle trusting us. Trusting our engineering. Trusting our decisions. Trusting that we would keep them safe. And we had failed them. Not because we didn't care. Not because we weren't smart enough or dedicated enough. We failed them because we had convinced ourselves that the shuttle was routine, that the risks were acceptable, that the schedule was more important than the uncertainty. We failed them because engineers who knew there was a problem were overruled by managers who didn't want to hear about problems. We failed them because we had started to believe our own PR. The shuttle was safe. The shuttle was reliable. The shuttle was routine. Until it wasn't. The days after January 28th, 1986, were the darkest of my life. Of all our lives. Kennedy Space Center became a ghost town. Not literally. There were more people there than ever, actually. Investigators, media, recovery teams. But it felt empty. It felt haunted. We had always been the place where impossible dreams came true. Where we did things no one else on Earth could do. Where we sent people to space and brought them home safe. Now we were the place where 7 people died in front of the world. The investigation started immediately. President Reagan appointed the Rogers Commission, formerly the Presidential Commission on the Space Shuttle Challenger accident. Headed by former Secretary of State William Rogers, it included astronauts Neil Armstrong and Sally Ride, test pilot Chuck Yeager, and, crucially, physicist Richard Feynman. NASA's own investigation teams were activated. Every piece of telemetry data was analyzed. Every photograph, every video frame, every sensor reading from the weeks leading up to the launch. And the recovery effort began. The Coast Guard and Navy mobilized everything they had. Ships, submarines, divers, remote-operated vehicles. The debris field covered several hundred square miles of ocean floor. They were looking for the crew cabin. We all knew they wouldn't find survivors. The impact with the ocean at that speed was unsurvivable. But families needed closure. The nation needed closure. It took weeks, but they found it. The crew cabin was located on the ocean floor, crushed by the impact, but recognizable. I wasn't part of the recovery team. I was stuck at Kennedy, giving interviews to investigators, going through my data logs, reconstructing everything I had seen and done on launch morning. The guilt was overwhelming. My systems hadn't failed. The life support systems were fine. They would have kept the crew alive all the way to orbit if we'd gotten there. But I was part of the team. I'd been in the firing room. I'd watched the countdown. I'd said my systems were go. Should I have known about the O-ring concerns? Should I have asked more questions about the cold? Should I have pushed harder for a delay? These questions tortured me. They still do. But the investigation was revealing something even more disturbing. It wasn't just an engineering failure. It was an organizational failure, a cultural failure. The engineers at Thiokol had recommended against launch. They had presented their data, they had explained their concerns, and they had been ignored. Not just ignored, actively dismissed, told to prove it was unsafe rather than being required to prove it was safe. Told to think about the program, the schedule, the bigger picture. When Richard Feynman joined the Rogers Commission, he was skeptical of NASA's official explanations. He started digging, asking uncomfortable questions, talking to engineers directly instead of going through the management chain. The famous moment came during a televised hearing. Feynman had obtained a piece of O-ring material. During a break, he dropped it in ice water. Then, during the hearing, he pulled it out and demonstrated that the material had lost its resilience. It was stiff. It couldn't flex properly. I took this stuff that I got out of your seals and I put it in ice water, and I discovered that when you put some pressure on it for a while and then undo it, it doesn't stretch back. It stays the same dimension. In other words, for a few seconds at least, and more seconds than that, there is no resilience in this particular material when it is at a temperature of 32 degrees. He had just demonstrated in front of the world exactly what the Thiokol engineers had been warning about on the night of January 27th. The O-rings couldn't seal properly in the cold. The investigation uncovered more. NASA managers had known about O-ring erosion problems for years. They had seen the damage on previous flights. They had even classified it as a criticality 1 issue, meaning a failure could result in loss of vehicle and crew. But they had normalized it. They had convinced themselves that because previous flights had succeeded despite O-ring erosion, it was an acceptable risk. They had started to view the erosion as normal rather than as a warning sign. This is what killed Challenger. Not the cold weather, not the O-rings themselves. It was the normalization of deviance. When you see something go wrong, but nothing bad happens, you start to think it's okay. You start to adjust your definition of normal to include the warning signs, and eventually you push so far beyond the original safety margins that catastrophe becomes inevitable. NASA had fallen into this trap. The shuttle program was under immense pressure to fly frequently. Congress wanted results for their billions of dollars. The military wanted to launch their satellites. The public wanted to see routine access to space. Schedule pressure, budget pressure, political pressure. And in that environment, warning signs got minimized. Concerns got dismissed. Engineers got overruled. The Rogers Commission report, released in June 1986, was devastating. It didn't just identify the technical cause, the O-ring failure in the cold weather. It identified the organizational and cultural causes. The Commission concluded that there was a serious flaw in the decision-making process leading up to the launch of Flight 51-L. A well-structured and managed system emphasizing safety would have flagged the rising doubts about the solid rocket booster joint seal. Had these matters been clearly stated and emphasized in the Flight Readiness Review, it seems likely that the launch of 51L might not have occurred when it did. The engineers had tried to stop it, and they had been overruled. 7 people died because managers made a decision that contradicted engineering data. For those of us who had been in the firing room, the report was both vindicating and gutting. Vindicating because it confirmed that the failure wasn't due to negligence or incompetence at the technical level. Gutting because it revealed just how broken the system had become. We had trusted that system. We had believed that when we declared our systems go, the same rigor was being applied to every other system. That engineering concerns would always override schedule pressure. We were wrong. On January 31st, 1986, 3 days after the disaster, President Reagan gave a memorial address at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. I watched it on a small television in one of the conference rooms at Kennedy. Surrounded by colleagues, all of us exhausted, grieving, trying to make sense of something that made no sense. Reagan was a gifted speaker, and he understood what the moment required. We come together today to mourn the loss of 7 brave Americans, to share the grief that we all feel, and perhaps in that sharing, to find the strength to bear our sorrow and the courage to look for the seeds of hope. He spoke about each crew member, their accomplishments, their dreams, their families. Dick Scobie, who had wanted to fly since seeing an Air Force pilot sign autographs at an air show when he was 12. Michael Smith, who had hoped the flight would give his wife and 3 children a little more understanding of what he did. Judy Resnick, who had said that what she wanted to do was make a significant contribution. Elon Izuka, who had made it his life's goal to become an astronaut after seeing the Apollo moon landings. Ron McNair, who had overcome poverty and discrimination to become a laser physicist and astronaut. Greg Jarvis, who had waited years for his chance to fly. And Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, the dreamer. Reagan said, "I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave." Then he addressed the school children who had watched the disaster unfold on television. "I know it's hard to understand that sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted, it belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future and will continue to follow them." And finally, the passage that everyone remembers, adapted from the poem High Flight by John Gillespie Magee, Jr. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us by the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. I'm not ashamed to say I cried. We all did. Because it captured something essential about why we did this work, why we took these risks, why we believed in the mission of space exploration even when it cost us so dearly. Those 7 people had believed in it too. They had known the risks. Every astronaut does. They had climbed into that shuttle anyway because they believed the dream was worth it, and we had let them down. The memorial services continued for weeks, at Arlington National Cemetery, at the Space Center in Houston, at schools and churches across the country. Krista McAuliffe's students from Concord High School held their own memorial. They had been so excited to watch their teacher in space. Instead, they had watched her die. That trauma rippled through an entire generation. If you were a kid in January 1986, watching on a school TV as the shuttle exploded, that image probably stayed with you forever. The Space Shuttle program was grounded indefinitely. All flights cancelled. The remaining orbiters, Columbia, Discovery, Atlantis, locked down while we figured out what went wrong and how to fix it. It would be 32 months before a shuttle flew again. 32 months of redesigning the solid rocket boosters, of implementing new safety protocols, of changing the culture at NASA, of relearning the lessons we should have never forgotten. At Kennedy Space Center, we held our own informal memorials. Small groups gathering at the end of shifts, sharing memories, supporting each other. I remember one night, maybe a week after the disaster, a group of us drove out to the beach near the pad. You could still see pad 39B in the distance, illuminated by floodlights, the pad where Challenger had launched. We stood there in silence for a long time, just watching the waves, thinking about what had happened. Finally, one of the older engineers spoke up. "We're going to fly again," he said. "We have to. For them." And he was right. We did have to fly again. Not because of political pressure or schedule demands, but because the dream they died for was still worth pursuing. But we had to do it right this time. We had to rebuild the culture. We had to make it okay for engineers to raise concerns without fear of being overruled or marginalized. We had to put safety first, genuinely and completely. The Rogers Commission made 9 major recommendations. Some were technical. Redesign the solid rocket boosters, improve the orbiter's escape systems, review all critical systems. But the most important recommendations were organizational. Create an independent safety organization within NASA. Improve communication between engineers and management. Include astronauts in all discussions of flight safety. Maintain a proper flight rate. Don't sacrifice safety for schedule. Implementing those recommendations took years. And honestly, I'm not sure we ever fully succeeded. Because the same pressures that led to Challenger never went away. Budget pressures, schedule pressures, political pressures, the temptation to normalize deviance when everything seems to be working. These are human problems, not technical problems, and they're much harder to solve. September 29th, 1988, 32 months after Challenger. 32 months of investigation, redesign, retraining, rebuilding. Discovery sat on pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center, the same pad where Challenger had launched. I was in the firing room again, older, maybe wiser, definitely more cautious. The mood was completely different from that morning in January 1986. There was no sense of routine, no casual confidence. Every single person in that room was acutely aware of what had happened the last time we'd launched a shuttle. The crew of STS-26, the return to flight mission, carried that weight too. Commander Rick Hawk, pilot Dick Covey, and mission specialists John Lounge, Dave Hilmers, and George Pinky Nelson. 5 experienced astronauts who knew exactly what they were signing up for. They had visited the families of the Challenger crew before the mission. They understood what was at stake. The solid rocket boosters had been completely redesigned. The field joints now had a 3rd O-ring, improved insulation, and a capture feature to prevent joint rotation. The seals had been tested at every temperature from Arctic cold to desert heat. We had backup escape systems now. The crew could potentially bail out of the orbiter during certain phases of flight if disaster struck again. We had a new safety organization, new communication protocols, new decision-making processes that gave engineers more authority to raise concerns. And we had a launch commit criteria document that was hundreds of pages long, explicitly defining acceptable parameters for every system, including temperature limits for the O-rings. We weren't going to make the same mistake twice. The countdown was the longest, most careful in shuttle history. We held for every minor concern. We triple-checked every system. I ran through my life support checks with obsessive attention to detail. Not because I thought I'd missed something the first time, my systems hadn't been the problem, but because I needed to know, absolutely know, that everything under my responsibility was perfect. To -9 minutes and holding. This was normally a routine hold. just a built-in pause in the countdown to give everyone a final chance to review. We held there for what felt like hours. The launch director polled every single station. Not just, are you go, but are you absolutely, completely, without any doubt whatsoever, go? My voice shook a little when I responded. Environmental control systems are go for launch. Everyone was go. We came out of the hold. The countdown proceeded. T-minus 31 seconds. The ground launch sequencer took over. T-minus 10 seconds. Main engine starting, and then the moment I'd been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Solid rocket booster ignition. The same event that had killed Challenger, but this time the field joints held. The redesigned O-rings sealed perfectly. No smoke puffs, no leaks, just clean, powerful thrust-lifting Discovery off the pad. I watched my displays, but I also watched the video feeds, studying the boosters, looking for any sign of the smoke that had appeared in Challenger's launch. Nothing. Clean ignition. Perfect flight. Discovery cleared the tower, executed the roll program, passed through max Q. Go at throttle up. Roger, go at throttle up. The same words we'd heard from Dick Scobie, but this time they weren't the last words. This time the mission continued. 8.5 minutes after launch, Discovery reached orbit. The firing room erupted in applause and cheers, people hugging each other, some crying, all of us releasing 32 months of tension and grief and fear. We had done it. We had returned to flight. NASA Administrator James Fletcher made a statement from the Launch Control Center. America has returned to space. This nation has never been afraid of challenges, and we're not going to start now. But in the quieter moments, when the cameras were off and the celebrations died down, we all knew the truth. We hadn't just returned to flight. We had barely avoided being grounded forever. If Discovery had failed, if anything had gone wrong on that return-to-flight mission, the shuttle program would have been over. The American space program might never have recovered. The stakes had been that high, and we carried that knowledge forward into every subsequent mission. I stayed with NASA for another 12 years after Challenger. I worked on dozens of shuttle missions. I watched us deploy the Hubble Space Telescope. I helped build the International Space Station. Every single launch, I thought about January 28, 1986. Every time we had a technical concern, I wondered if we were falling back into the old patterns. Normalizing deviance, prioritizing schedule over safety. Sometimes I spoke up about things that bothered me. Sometimes I was overruled, and I had to decide whether to escalate or trust that the system would work. It's not easy, being the person who raises concerns. You get labeled as difficult, as not a team player, as someone who doesn't understand the bigger picture. But I'd seen what happens when engineers stay silent, when they defer to management, when they convince themselves that it's probably fine. 7 people die. February 1st, 2003. I had retired from NASA by then. I was consulting for an aerospace company, still connected to the space program, but not directly involved in shuttle operations anymore. I woke up that Saturday morning and turned on the news, and my heart sank. Columbia, the first shuttle, the oldest orbiter, the one that had proven the concept worked, had disintegrated during re-entry over Texas. 7 more astronauts dead. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, Ilan Ramon. I sat there watching the news coverage with a sense of horrified déjà vu. This couldn't be happening again. We had learned our lessons. We had fixed the culture. We had put safety first, hadn't we? The investigation revealed a different failure mode, but the same organizational problems. During Columbia's launch on January 16th, a piece of foam insulation had broken off the external tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing. The impact had created a hole in the thermal protection system, the heat-resistant tiles and panels that protected the shuttle during the scorching temperatures of re-entry. NASA engineers had seen the foam strike on video. They had discussed it. Some had even requested that the Air Force use spy satellites to photograph the wing and assess the damage. But management had declined. They assessed it as not a significant concern. Foam strikes had happened before. They were considered a maintenance issue, not a safety issue. The normalization of deviance. Again. For 16 days, Columbia's crew orbited Earth, conducted their science experiments, and prepared for home. They had no idea their shuttle was mortally wounded. During re-entry, superheated plasma, reaching temperatures of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, entered through the hole in the wing. It melted the internal structure. The wing failed. The orbiter disintegrated. The crew cabin broke apart. The astronauts died instantly from trauma and depressurization. Debris fell across Texas and Louisiana, just like Challenger, except over land instead of ocean. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, led by Admiral Hal Gaiman, issued a report that was even more scathing than the Rogers Commission report. Because we should have known better. We had learned these lessons in 1986. We had fixed these problems, except we hadn't. Not really. The investigation found the same cultural problems. Schedule pressure. Management overruling engineers. Normalizing anomalies that should have been treated as warnings. The foam strikes had been happening for years. Every shuttle mission saw some foam loss from the external tank. And every time it happened without catastrophic consequences, NASA's safety margins eroded a little more. They had even developed a saying, "Foam is a turnaround issue, not a flight safety issue." A turnaround issue, something you fix between flights, not something that could kill the crew. Until it did. Reading the Columbia investigation report, I felt sick. We had failed to learn the most important lesson from Challenger. It's not enough to fix the technical problems. You have to fix the culture. You have to maintain constant vigilance against the normalization of deviance. You have to create a system where engineers can challenge management decisions without fear of reprisal. And you have to keep doing it. Forever. Because the pressures never go away and the temptation to cut corners is always there. After Columbia, NASA grounded the shuttle fleet again, this time for 2.5 years. They redesigned the external tank to minimize foam loss. They developed inspection techniques so crews could examine their orbiters in space using camera booms. They established a requirement that any damage discovered during launch would result in a rescue mission. The shuttle flew 22 more missions after Columbia. Every single one was conducted with obsessive attention to safety. And in 2011, the shuttle program ended. Atlantis landed for the final time on July 21st, bringing down the curtain on 30 years of shuttle operations. 135 missions total, 2 catastrophic failures, 14 astronauts killed, a success rate of 98.5%. In most fields, that would be considered excellent. In human spaceflight, it's unacceptable. Because the cost of failure isn't just hardware and money. It's lives, it's families shattered, it's children who grow up without parents. It's dreams cut short, and it's the burden carried forever by those of us who survived, who are part of the system, who wonder if we could have done something different. It's been 38 years since Challenger. I'm an old man now, retired, grandchildren, a life far removed from the firing rooms and launch pads of Kennedy Space Center. But I never really left. In my dreams, I'm still there, still watching the countdown clock, still monitoring my systems, still seeing that cloud bloom across the blue sky where Challenger should have been. I've talked to therapists about it, about survivors' guilt, about PTSD, about the weight of knowing you were part of something that killed people, even if your specific systems weren't the ones that failed. Some of my former colleagues refuse to talk about it at all. They've buried it deep, locked it away in some compartment of their minds they never open. Others, like me, feel compelled to tell the story, to make sure people understand what happened and why, to try to prevent it from happening again. Because the lessons of Challenger aren't just about spaceflight. They're about any complex system where human lives depend on proper decision-making. They're about medicine, where schedule pressure and cost concerns can lead to cutting corners that kill patients. They're about aviation, where normalization of deviance and failure to heed warnings have caused disasters. They're about construction, where budget pressure can lead to structural shortcuts that cause buildings to collapse. They're about any field where technical experts can be overruled by managers who don't fully understand the risks. The fundamental lessons are simple. First, never normalize deviance. If something is happening that's outside design specifications, that's a warning sign, not a new normal. The fact that nothing catastrophic has happened yet doesn't mean everything is fine. Second, listen to the engineers, the people closest to the technical details, the ones who understand the systems deeply. When they raise concerns, those concerns must be taken seriously. Don't ask them to prove something is unsafe. Make safety the default assumption. Third, schedule pressure is the enemy of safety. When you start making decisions based on timelines and politics rather than engineering data, you're setting yourself up for catastrophe. Fourth, maintain constant vigilance. You can't fix a safety culture once and declare victory. It requires ongoing effort, constant reinforcement, continuous questioning of assumptions. These aren't complicated ideas, but they're incredibly hard to implement in real organizations with real pressures and real human beings making decisions. Because we want to believe we can do more with less. We want to believe we can go faster without sacrificing safety. We want to believe that past success guarantees future success. And those desires, those very human tendencies, can kill people. I think about the Thiokol engineers often, Bob Eberling, Roger Boyce-Yoli, and the others who tried to stop the launch. Bob Eberling carried crushing guilt for the rest of his life. He felt like he hadn't argued forcefully enough, hadn't made his case clearly enough, hadn't saved those 7 lives. Before he died in 2016, NPR did an interview with him. He said, "I think that was one of the mistakes that God made. He shouldn't have picked me for that job." When the interview aired, thousands of people, including NASA engineers and astronauts, reached out to him. They told him it wasn't his fault. He had done everything he could. He had tried to stop it. The failure wasn't his. It was the system's. I hope that brought him some peace in his final days. Roger Boyce-Yoli testified to the Rogers Commission. He explained what had happened in that teleconference on January 27th. He showed the data. He described how the engineers were overruled. For his honesty, he was ostracized at Thiokol. Colleagues stopped talking to him. His career was effectively over. That's another lesson from Challenger. We have to protect the people who speak up, who challenge bad decisions, who insist on safety over schedule. If we punish them, if we make them pariahs, then the next time there's a critical safety concern, people will stay silent and more people will die. So what did we really learn from Challenger? In some ways, a lot. The technical failures were identified and corrected. New safety protocols were implemented. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned. Communication procedures were improved. NASA became, for a while at least, much more safety conscious. The return to flight mission was meticulously planned. The subsequent shuttle missions were conducted with greater care. But in other ways, we didn't learn enough. Columbia proved that. 17 years after Challenger, we made essentially the same mistakes. Different technical failure, same organizational failures, and it's not just NASA. We see the same patterns playing out in other industries. The Boeing 737 MAX disasters. 2 crashes, 346 people dead because schedule pressure and cost concerns led to inadequate safety analysis and training. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill. 11 workers killed, massive environmental disaster because warnings were ignored and safety procedures were bypassed to save time and money. The Surfside condominium collapse. 98 people killed because structural concerns were downplayed and repairs were delayed. Over and over, the same story. Technical experts raise concerns. Management dismisses them. Disaster follows. We keep relearning the same lessons at the cost of human lives. But there's another legacy of Challenger that I think about too. In the immediate aftermath, people wondered if the space program was over, if we would abandon the dream of spaceflight because the risks were too great. We didn't. We grieved. We investigated. We fixed the problems. And we flew again. That's important. Not because space exploration is more important than human life. It's not. But because difficult, dangerous things are still worth doing if we do them the right way. The challenge is maintaining that commitment to doing them the right way. To not cutting corners. To not normalizing deviance. To not sacrificing safety for schedule. Today's space program looks very different from 1986. NASA retired the shuttle. We now rely on commercial companies like SpaceX and Boeing for access to space. The International Space Station is aging, and plans are underway for commercial space stations to replace it. We're going back to the moon with the Artemis program. We're planning missions to Mars, and all of these efforts carry the same risks, the same potential for catastrophic failure if we don't remain vigilant. I watch these new programs with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. Excitement because we're pushing the boundaries again, because a new generation of engineers and astronauts is pursuing the dream. Anxiety because I know how easy it is to slip into complacency, how schedule pressure and budget constraints can lead to dangerous decisions. I watch SpaceX's aggressive testing program, blowing up prototype after prototype to learn quickly, and I appreciate the different approach. They're failing fast and learning from failures without putting human lives at risk. But I also wonder if that culture of moving fast and breaking things will scale properly when human lives are on the line. I don't have answers. I just have questions and concerns born from experience. What I do know is this. The 7 astronauts who died aboard Challenger believed the dream was worth the risk. They trained for years. They prepared mentally and physically. They said goodbye to their families and climbed into that shuttle knowing that spaceflight is dangerous. But they trusted us to manage those risks properly, to make good decisions, to put their safety first. We failed that trust. And the only way to honor their memory is to never, ever forget why we failed. Not to punish ourselves endlessly, not to abandon difficult endeavors, but to commit genuinely and completely to learning from those failures, to building organizations where safety really does come first, where engineers can speak up without fear, where schedule pressure doesn't override sound judgment, where warning signs are heeded, not normalized. It's hard. I won't pretend it's easy. The pressures are real. The temptations are real. The very human tendency to believe it'll probably be fine is real. But it's necessary, because the alternative is more disasters, more lives lost, more families shattered, more preventable tragedies. I started by telling you that January 28, 1986 was 73 seconds that changed everything. But that's not quite right. Those 73 seconds were the result of decisions made over years, of organizational culture that developed over decades, of pressure that built incrementally until it overwhelmed good judgment. The explosion wasn't the cause, it was the effect. The real story of Challenger isn't about O-rings or cold weather or technical failures. It's about people, about how we make decisions under pressure, about how organizations can lose their way even when filled with smart, dedicated individuals. It's about the danger of success, how achieving something difficult repeatedly can make you forget just how difficult and dangerous it really is. It's about the critical importance of listening to warnings, of respecting expertise, of maintaining healthy skepticism about your own assumptions. And it's about the weight carried by those who survive, who were part of the system, who ask themselves decades later if there was something more they could have done. I don't have a neat conclusion for you. I don't have a satisfying ending that wraps everything up. Because the story isn't over. We're still making the same mistakes. We're still learning the same lessons at the cost of human lives. What I can tell you is this. If you're ever in a position where you see something wrong, where you know there's a problem but you're being pressured to stay silent or go along, speak up. Even if it's uncomfortable, even if it makes you unpopular, even if people tell you you're overreacting, speak up. Because lives might depend on it. And if you're in management, if you're in a position of authority, listen. Really listen to the people who understand the technical details. Don't ask them to prove something is unsafe. Ask yourself if you can prove it's safe. Create a culture where raising concerns is encouraged, not punished, where safety really does come first, not just in the mission statement, but in every decision. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Dick Scobie, Michael Smith, Judy Resnick, Elon Izuka, Ron McNair, Greg Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe believed in the dream of spaceflight. They believed it was worth the risks. They deserved better than what we gave them. We can't bring them back. We can't undo January 28, 1986. But we can honor their memory by learning from their deaths, by building better systems, by making better decisions, by never, ever forgetting what happens when we don't. That's the real legacy of Challenger, not just the technical lessons, but the human ones. Listen to your engineers. Respect expertise. Question assumptions. Don't normalize deviance. Put safety first, always. Thank you for listening to this story, for taking the time to hear about what happened that day and why it matters. If this resonated with you, if you think these lessons are important, share this video. Talk about it. Keep the conversation alive. Because the moment we forget, the moment we assume we've learned these lessons and don't need to keep reinforcing them, that's when we set ourselves up for the next disaster. And if you work in any field where safety matters, where lives depend on good decisions, whether that's aerospace, medicine, construction, or anything else, carry these lessons with you. Be the engineer who speaks up. Be the manager who listens. Be the person who insists on doing things right, even when it's hard. 7 people died because we didn't do that. Let's make sure their deaths meant something. Let's make sure we never forget. Thank you.